I'm Jeanne Caldwell, and welcome to In His Presence. Our guest today knows the hard questions and situations we face in today's world. She's written a new book, Choosing Forgiveness, and she's going to share with us how forgiveness is God's plan for our lives. Welcome, Nancy Lee DeMoss.
Thank you, Sister Jeanne.
So glad to have you back with us.
Thank
you were
you.
with us a few years or months.
It's been a while, but it's good to be back.
But it was a blessing then, and it's going to be a blessing today. This new book, Choosing Forgiveness, is a powerful subject, and we want to talk about it. It's not a new subject, so what caused you to examine the topic?
Well, it's just such a huge issue. You know, the fact is we live in a broken, fallen world, and we get hurt. People wrong us, they sin against us, and sometimes it's big, huge issues. Sometimes it's just those little issues for somebody, you know, in a marriage or a parent-child relationship or in the workplace, somebody hurts us. And as Christians, we say that we have been forgiven, and we have, by Jesus Christ. But I have asked thousands of women, as I've spoken at conferences over the years, how many of you would say that there is some past offense or some issue in your heart, somebody has hurt you, and you have never fully forgiven them? There's some root of bitterness in your heart. And then I ask them to raise their hands. And I want to tell you, almost always, it's at least 90% of the women in the room who say, there's some bitterness in my heart. There's some unforgiveness in my heart. Well, God's Word tells us, and we know from our own experience, that if you let that stay in there, it's deadly, it's destructive, it will destroy you. And so I just want to see people get set free. And the subtitle to this book is Choosing Forgiveness, Your Journey to Freedom.
That's
this is the way
wonderful,
people get set
because
free.
that's what it is. It's a journey to freedom. So what are some of the fruits of unforgiveness?
Well, you know, bitterness is so damaging. It even affects us physically. I remember hearing a woman who said that she had requested prayer in one of our conferences for some back pain that she had been experiencing.
Oh, my goodness.
And then I read in this Reader's Digest article a doctor who specializes in back pain saying that he believes that most back pain is actually related to anger in people's hearts that they have not dealt with God's way. Now, that doesn't mean if you have a backache that necessarily you're a bitter person, but even physically, we experience consequences of not forgiving people. And then, of course, in relationships, I mean, divorce. Parents and children who don't speak to each other, and people who are angry and vengeful and separated from each other. It can keep people awake at night. Emotional disorders, depression. So many of these issues, in many, many cases, spring out of just holding grudges, things we've never fully forgiven people for.
Wow, that is something. What are some of the evidences in individual lives and in relationships and in our culture?
Well, in the culture, you know, we have such an angry culture, and you see these, you read in the news about these random acts of violence and kids walking into classrooms with a gun and just mowing down people. You say, and road rage. You say, where does all this come from? Well, it's the result of anger and hurt that's not been dealt with God's way. You know, they say the most dangerous animal in the forest is the one that's been wounded. So we have a lot of wounded people who are going around wounding other people as a result of not dealing with their hurts God's way.
Wow, that is something. Well, why do you feel that forgiveness is an especially important topic for Christians?
Well, we have been forgiven, and so we're supposed to be channels of God's forgiveness, giving out His grace and His forgiveness to others. But Jesus said, if you refuse to forgive your brother who has sinned against you, to forgive the person who has hurt you, if you hold that in your heart, if you become a debt collector, you say, I'm going to make you pay. If you refuse to forgive, then Jesus says you will never be able to experience God's forgiveness and God's love and God's grace in your own life. You stop up the free flow of God's Spirit. And I think so many people who are struggling with assurance of their salvation, they're struggling to feel God's forgiveness for their own sins. I think one of the biggest reasons is that they're refusing to forgive others.
Boy, that's something. Well, in your one of your chapters in your book, you talk about the story of Regina, whose her daughter was killed by a drive-by shooter. And she
12-year-old
forgave.
daughter.
My. Tell us about that.
And the woman had to, it was just this horrendous act of violence. But the woman, when she finally spoke up to the press some years later, she said the only way she could deal with this was to forgive her daughter's killers. And she went further. She went so far, and this is what the scripture teaches about not only forgiving, but actually coming to the place where you can bless those who have sinned against you. She actually went and got involved in ministry to prisoners. These kids young men who had killed her daughter ended up in prison. This woman got involved in prison ministry, trying to minister healing and grace to the kind of people who had killed her daughter. And then she tells the story of the day that she was actually in a prison doing ministry, and one of her daughter's killers actually walked by her, and how she had, of course, he was in chains, and but she had to go through this process. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't have to pay consequences, that he was released from that. And let me be quick to say, if there is abuse going on in a marriage, forgiveness does not mean that there are not consequences. Yeah. There are consequences, and you may need to go to the law. You may need to get your church leadership involved in dealing with a person who is violating God's law and is creating danger in your marriage, but you can't do it with a vengeful heart.
That's true.
You have to do it with a heart that says, God, you have forgiven me, and for Jesus' sake, I want you to forgive and release this prisoner. And when we forgive that person, we're not letting them off the hook, which is what it sometimes feels like. What we're doing is saying, I'm not the judge.
That's true.
I'm putting that person into God's courtroom and letting God be the one who deals with them.
That's wonderful. Well, why do you emphasize that forgiveness is a choice?
That's so important, because we tend to feel, if I don't feel forgiving, if I still feel just the emotional pain of that hurt, then I can't forgive. But I think we need to understand that forgiveness is not a feeling, and that, as is true in so many areas of our lives, in love and a marriage, you make the right choices and then the feelings follow. And so if we wait to feel this great gush of whatever, kindness or mercy toward that person who has sinned against us, we'll never forgive them. But if we say, Lord, as an act of obedience, as an act of my will, I choose to release this person from their debt. I'm relinquishing the right to pay them back. Yeah. That's what forgiveness is. Yeah. I'm clearing their record. Yeah. When I do that by faith, then in time, God deals with those feelings.
Yeah, wow. Well, you mentioned a debt collector. What is your definition of a debt collector?
When somebody hurts us, we do one of two things. Generally, we either say, I'm going to make you pay back. And so we may withhold love from them. We may punish them in some way, silently or overtly. We may talk about them to others, but some way we're making them pay back. But that path just leads to broken relationships. It leads to anger and bitterness. The other path is to choose the pathway of forgiveness and to say, I'm clearing your record. And forgiveness, Sister Jeanne, is really a promise. It's a promise that I will not hold this against you. I will not bring it up against you again. Not to you, not to God, not to anybody else. I'm releasing you from my courtroom. I'm letting you go.
Yes.
And one of the word pictures I use in the book is the delete button on the computer.
Yes,
and I don't know about you, but I know just enough about computers to be dangerous. But I've learned the hard way. If you press that little button that says DEL, whatever you've had there is
gone.
It's gone.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when we forgive, we're pressing the delete button. Now, that doesn't mean that person they still have to deal with God.
Yeah.
If they haven't repented, they're not going to be released.
Yeah.
But I'm releasing them from my anger, my bitterness, and my right to pay back.
Boy, that is so powerful. Well, what happens when we hold on to grudges? What are the consequences of unforgiveness?
You know what? We ultimately become a prisoner of the person we think we're holding in prison.
Yep.
We become in bondage ourselves,
yes, we do.
And we don't experience the free flow of God's love, His grace, His forgiveness in our lives. We can't move on. We get stuck emotionally, spiritually, mentally, relationally. We end up in bondage, and we think we're holding them prisoners, but we're actually the ones who get hurt. Somebody said that bitterness is like, or unforgiveness is like an acid inside your own heart. It destroys and eats the container in which it's held. So somebody else said it's like drinking poison and hoping somebody else will die. We're the ones who end up
That is a
so
powerful
destroyed through
statement.
bitterness.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. Well, we're going to stop and take a short break, and when we come back, Nancy shares what true forgiveness is. Don't go away.
Stir up your spirit and refresh your soul with Jeanne Caldwell's album, Colors, with songs like Didn't Think It Could Be,
I didn't think it could be till it happened to me.
and My Father.
I want to be more like him, more like my father, more like him every day.
You're sure to be refreshed every time you listen. Colors is just $14 plus shipping and handling.
To get your copy, visit our website at vtntv.com or call 1-888-641-3375.
All I could think to say was, get it out of the street. In fact, that was the last thing I remember saying. The next thing I remember was being put into an ambulance on a stretcher. I had absolutely no fear, for I felt God's presence. The doctors wanted to put 3 rods in my back to support my vertebrae column, but I chose not to have the surgery. I knew in my heart that God would supernaturally take care of me.
Learning to Trust God's Faithfulness is a book about Jeanne Caldwell's real-life encounters with God. She shares them with you in the hope that your faith and trust in a loving Heavenly Father will increase.
To order the book, Learning to Trust God's Faithfulness, call 1-888-641-3375 or visit our website at vtntv.com.
We're talking today to Nancy Lee DeMoss about her new book, Choosing Forgiveness. If you would like to order a copy or just want more information about Nancy, here's her contact information. Revive Our Hearts, Post Office Box 2000, Niles, Michigan, 49120. And her phone is 1-800-569-5859. Or her website is www.reviveourhearts.com. Well, I tell you what, this is a wonderful subject, and I would think that people are going to really want to buy that book.
You know what, it's such a huge need, and I think sometimes people are afraid to buy a book like
I'm
this
sure.
because we know that there are these hurts in our hearts, these wounds. Everybody has them. Everybody has them. And we have these broken relationships and the pain, and we want the people who hurt us to deal with their issues.
Yes, that's
but
true.
we don't want to have to be the one who makes the choice to forgive. So I don't know if this will ever be a best-selling book, but I'll tell you, Sister Jeanne, if people knew the freedom and the joy and the blessing and the fullness that they could have in their lives, if they would choose the pathway of forgiveness, they would flock to buy a book like this. I remember a woman telling me in my church, not too far from here, and she came up to me in tears in her eyes, and she just had so many family situations that had hurt her, and she says, I'm reading through this book, but it's really hard. There's some pain involved. But on the other side, I've sat with this woman and watched as her circumstances didn't change. The past hurts, she couldn't undo those, but God has transformed this woman, and now she's ministering to others and helping them experience freedom because of making this choice to forgive.
Yeah, boy, that's wonderful. Well, what is true forgiveness?
Forgiveness is really saying, I relinquish the right to pay you back. I'm not the judge, I'm not the jury, I'm turning you over to God, I'm releasing you from the courtroom of my mind, I'm making a promise, I will not hold this against you again. You have to deal with God about this issue.
That's wonderful. Well, are we letting the other person off the hook when we forgive them?
No, not at all. And I think that's something we're afraid of sometimes, is that this is not just. You know, we have this sense of justice that says it's not fair, they should have to pay. Well, that's God's problem. That's God's issue. God says vengeance is not yours. Vengeance is mine. And so then we say, well, God, you get him. Well, that's not the point. The point is, Lord, you've dealt with me in mercy. What if we only extended to what if God only forgave us to the extent that we're willing to forgive others? We would be in serious trouble. And so we're saying, God, you have extended incredible grace and mercy to me. And because of that, as you have forgiven me, I'm willing now to forgive others.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, how does whether or not I choose to forgive impact my daily life?
It impacts it in every way. I find so many people today, you can look at a lot of women today and actually see the lines of bitterness and unforgiveness on their faces. You know, there's nothing wrong with looking 80 years old if you're 80 years old, but I've seen 50-year-old women who look 80 because of the unforgiveness. Our faces tell it. You can just look at so many women today, and there's a hardness, and there's an anger there that's just flying off the handle, and a lot of chronic depression in many cases is the result of the refusal to forgive. So it affects our relationships, it affects our peace or our lack of peace, it affects our capacity to do our work, to serve our families. It's all affected by, and by the way, unforgiveness is something we pass on to our children, to the next generation. In fact, I have here an email I came across today as I was thinking about this from a man who had been in Christian ministry for many years, and he said, forgiveness is the major message of my life in ministry. It was not until I fully forgave my father and his alcohol and family abuse over many years that I was able to be free from him emotionally. And now, having forgiven his dad, this is an older man, he's forgiving his dad, he said, I've had a whole new freedom to love my wife and my children in a way that my father never could. He said, my children were turning from God and from the church as long as I lived life stuck by unforgiveness. I looked like my dad, I acted like him, but when God set me free and I set my dad free, I was free. He said, when we don't forgive, we're bound to the people and destined to repeat their folly in some form through our own attitudes. Our children are wounded by this, and they receive the bitter torch of the bitterness curse and carry it to the third and fourth generation.
Oh my goodness
Don't want that
gracious.
to happen.
No, we don't.
On the other hand, we can extend God's mercy and grace, and our children can see that, and they can be helped to walk in forgiveness and grace themselves.
That's wonderful. Well, it's one thing to forgive someone if they ask for forgiveness, but what if they never ask? Or what
And
if
in
the
some
apology never
cases, they
comes?
don't. You know, I heard a very touching story recently. I was speaking in Houston and for a weekend conference, and a couple days later, I ran into a pastor whose women had come to that conference, and he said, thank you for the conference. He said, I got to tell you this story. The conference ended on Saturday afternoon. Several of the women had carpooled together, and the woman who was driving on the way home said to the other ladies, would you mind if I make a little stop on the way home? And the lady said that would be fine. To their surprise, she pulled the car into a cemetery. She stopped the car, she got out, she said, I'll be back in a few minutes. She came back about 10 minutes later, and she told the lady, she said, I have not been at this cemetery in 45 years. She said, my dad is buried here. She said, I know he's not here anymore, but she said, I had to go to his grave. And I had to say to him, and I had just spoken on forgiveness at this conference that afternoon. She said, I had to go to his grave and I had to say to him, Daddy, I forgive you for sexually abusing me 45 years ago when I was a teenage girl. So here is a woman now, 60s, saying after 45 years she's going back to this place. Her dad couldn't ask her for forgiveness. He's buried there. He can't come back. He can't undo the wrongs of the past. He may never have repented, but she knew that to be free, she had to go and do this. Well, this pastor was telling me this story. He said, this woman is not, you know, she's not an emotional type person. She's very private. He said she came to church yesterday morning, the next day after the conference, after going to this grave. He said she stood up in church and she told the whole church this story. And he said she kept saying, I'm free, I'm free. The women who were with her in the car said when she came back to that car, she looked like a young woman. She was so released. And the pastor said, you got to understand, she's not a big expressive woman. She's very private, but she was so set free. Well, this is a horrendous issue. I shared this story with in another small group not too long ago, and a woman came up to me afterward and she said, that's my story. And it's the story of a lot of people listening right now, or something similar. And I just want to say, if you want to be free, you've got to press that delete button to choose to forgive. Whether they ever ask for forgiveness, whether they ever repent, you have to leave that to the Lord. But you can be free.
Yeah. Now, how does a person deal with the reoccurring offense when old wounds are opened again and again?
And sometimes you're living with that person,
Yes,
and they haven't
that's true.
changed, and it's going on and on. We have to keep walking in forgiveness. And again, let me just say, that doesn't mean that you become a punching bag for your husband, that you stand there and say, just go ahead and hit me again. The police may need to be called. The pastors of the church may need to be involved in the situation. But as you're dealing with this, you're dealing with it in a heart of compassion, a heart that desires for them to be restored to God, not in a vengeful spirit or attacking or trying to get your due. You're leaving that to the Lord. And there are women, my ministry is primarily to women, and I know there are women who are, and watching right now, who are living with, I talked last night with a woman whose 20-something young adult daughter is in rebellion, is making some very foolish choices, and it's not getting better. So that mom is having to choose day after day to forgive this daughter who's hurting her deeply, to keep reaching out, to keep extending the love of Christ. And that mom said, I just have to let God keep working on me and leaving my daughter to God. So it may be ongoing, but how many times a day does God forgive us?
That's the truth.
He keeps sending mercy and grace to us. And we can't forgive others that way ourselves, but because He lives in us, He can forgive through us.
Wow, that's true. Well, how about the woman who was abused as a child? Is that the story
And that's
you were
like this
telling?
woman who went to the grave of her dad and said, you know, I can't undo this. That is a horrendous issue. And I want to say God hates that. And God hates that that happened to that woman when she was a little girl. But you cannot make it right. You can't change it by holding bitterness and unforgiveness in your heart.
What about the person who says, I just can't forgive myself?
And I think a lot of people feel that. And I think when they say that, what they really mean is, I don't feel forgiven for something that I have done. I just interviewed for our Revive Our Hearts radio program several women who have had abortions. And many listeners, a third of women today, 1 out of 3 women have had an abortion. And that's a lot of hurt and pain there. And many of those women feel, I can't forgive myself. But what we're really saying is, God can't forgive me. Or I'm bigger than God or greater than God. And God says, look, I have forgiven you. If you've confessed, you've repented, receive my forgiveness by grace, by faith, and choose to believe that you have been forgiven.
Wow. Well, how does someone get started in choosing to forgive?
You know, I think first to just make a list of the people who've hurt you and what they've done. Write it down. And how have they sinned against you? And then write down, and we tell how to do this in the book, Choosing Forgiveness. Write down, how have you responded to that person? Did you resent them? Did you speak evil of them to your friends? Do you need to go back and ask their forgiveness for how you may have sinned against them in your response? And then make the choice, by God's grace, say, Lord, I choose to delete this. I choose to forgive and leave the consequences with God, and then let God bring the healing of the emotions that you need in your heart.
Okay, lastly, what if we need to forgive God? What if we've been angry at God, thinking He did this or He did that? What do we do about that?
Well, many people today are angry at God, and ultimately our bitterness is toward God because we think He could have changed this.
Yeah,
He didn't help me in this situation. And let me just say, and we know that God does not need to be forgiven.
No.
God has never sinned against us, and we need to recognize that our anger toward God is an offense toward God, that we're the ones who need to be forgiven. God can be trusted. God never does anything that is not pure and holy and right and good. And so to confess our anger to the Lord and say, Lord, I'm the one who's in need of forgiveness.
Yeah. Well, we're talking today to Nancy Lee DeMoss about her new book, Choosing Forgiveness. If you'd like to order a copy or just want more information about Nancy, here is her contact information. Revive Our Hearts, Post Office Box 2000, Niles, Michigan, 49120. Her phone number is 1-800-569-5959. And her website is www.reviveourhearts.com. Now, have you seen the power of forgiveness illustrated in others' lives? Maybe in your own life.
Oh, I'll tell you, while I was writing this book, as I came to the end, I found myself just dealing with some hurts that weren't a big deal, but you know, we can make those things a big deal. And I found myself mulling them over in my heart and in my mind and feeling angry and resentful. And the words I had written in this, the words I'd written in this book came back, let it go. Let it go. And I have to make that choice daily. You have to make that choice. In this ministry, there are times when you get hurt or in your family, but I have seen in my own life and in so many, many people, hundreds, thousands of people across this nation, the freedom, the fullness, the blessing that comes when they make the choice to forgive. It's like you enter into a whole new life,
right.
A life of grace and peace and joy. It really is your journey to freedom when you choose the pathway of forgiveness.
Yeah. Well, lastly, how do we bless our enemies?
Well, that's hard. It's not easy. It takes faith. But when we come to the place where we can say, Lord, I want to return good for evil, then we actually overcome evil. Rather than being overcome by it, if we give evil back, we get overcome by evil. But if we bless those who have sinned against us, we pray for them, we seek for ways to do good to them, then we actually overcome evil with good. And that's when you know you've really had the triumph over that bitterness and that unforgiveness.
Yeah, that is so powerful, Nancy. And I know that there are going to be people that want to purchase this book. I'm going to get one myself, and and I think that people would want to get one too. It's going to be an excellent book for people to read who have anger maybe still in their hearts.
Yes.
And God will deliver them and will set them free.
Yes.
Her contact information once again is Revive Our Hearts, Post Office Box 2000, Niles, Michigan, for 9120, and her phone number is 1-800-569-5959. So contact her and get the information that you need. And I want you to know, in His presence is fullness of joy. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today for In His Presence. You can write Jeanne Caldwell at Post Office Box 26207, Little Rock, Arkansas 72221, or email her at jeannicaldwell@vtntv.com. Join us next time as we meet in His Presence.